Hi, I'm Tom Shoebridge. Welcome back to So You Want to Be a Screenwriter. We're going to show a few clips of important movies, and what I want you to think about is these are all here because they are great screen stories.
What do you think of the chances for war in Europe?
I've talked with the responsible leaders, the great powers, England, France, Germany, and Italy. They're too intelligent to embark on a project which would mean the end of civilization as we now know it. You can take my word for it. There'll be no war.
She waited in the Dragon's Keep, in the highest room of the tallest tower, for her true love and true love's first kiss. Yeah. Like that's ever gonna happen. What a load.
Somebody once told me the world is gonna roll me. I ain't the sharpest tool in the shed.
A screen story is a completely different animal than every other kind of story, and that's because it is a different medium. The Canadian philosopher Marshall McLuhan said the medium is the message, and what he meant by that is that the medium that is projecting whatever kind of information it is the message. So in prose, language is the medium. We take words and put them on paper in a logical order with punctuation and spacing, and that becomes the medium. And that story is a story for print. A screen story has to be a completely different animal. First of all, it has to be a moving story because these are the movies, as they used to be called, okay? And that is because the images are in constant motion even when the character is stopped. As you know, 24 frames in a regular feature film or however many lines of pixelation in video, the story is constantly having to move. And so therefore, the way that a story is designed for the screen is completely different than for a novel. I remember a novel once that I read, an excellent novel, in which the major character was introduced on page 78. It was an award-winning novel. If that was a screenplay, the theater would have been empty long before we would have been introduced to the major character. So the fact that our stories on screen are about 2 hours, and Samuel Goldwyn once figured that out. He said, that's as long as my bum can take it. And so he also said that he realized it was a bad story when he recognized that he was sitting as opposed to being involved in the movie. So when we are designing stories for the screen, we have to think about the medium that they're going to be projected on. So the instant that the screen is alive with an image, the story has begun. And even if it's if it starts in the future or in the past of the actual story, the story is being presented in the present. And that's a very important concept, that the reality that is created by the moving picture is completely different than the reality that happens in a novel. In a novel, we project everything inside our imagination. In the films, everybody in the business has decided what image we're going to see. The director has determined what the shot's going to look like, the cinematographer, all of the colors and lighting, the costume designer, the person who selects the cast, they all have made a decision of what experience we're going to have. So it's a completely different medium. So you have to think differently about writing a screen story. And that's why the visualization of a story is so essential to a screenwriter. that they have to be able to project that in their mind so that they can then figure out what it's going to look like when it eventually gets made. The aspect of storytelling on screen is structured then quite differently. And we're going to spend a lot of time taking apart the structure of a screen play. But now we're just talking about screen stories. And so we have to have a story that makes itself suitable for the screen. And this is when people like myself who read scripts decide that this story isn't big enough for the screen. And what that means is not that it has to be a spectacular story filled with action and all kinds of special effects. It's rather that the story has a kind of innate power that will allow it to be sustained for 90 consecutive minutes at the minimum, okay? We think of screenplays as being around 100 pages and 100 minutes. So that's number one. Is this story big enough to sustain itself for that long? The second consideration is that this story has some kind of theme. That means it means something. That means that it's held together organically. If I look back at the film The Silence that I mentioned before, one of the things happened is that everything was about love. The entire movie, every scene, every character in some way reflected an aspect of love. And that's what made it so profound. In good comedies, what for me makes great comedy is that the joke is the same throughout, except it's being turned like a crystal so it looks differently, but it's held together organically. So that's something that you will have to think about when you get your story done. Remember, I'm trying to show you that we're moving from storytelling into screenwriting. We have to develop the story and get it to a stage that it's ready to become a screenplay before we start the screenplay. So I'm urging everybody not to sit down at their computers and write fade in and start with the very first scene. What you're trying to do is to work out all the dynamics of this story that will become a screen story. The thing that we will spend a lot of time on later is talking about character, because we human beings are fascinated by character, other human beings. That's why we expect so much from actors, but because they have to convince us that they are that person. A long time ago, I came up with a notion that I understood why cinema or video was different than theater. In theater, there is an expression that you have a willing suspension of disbelief. That means that you know that those are just actors coming out on stage and that they're pretending to be a king or a fool or a queen or whatever. And you believe that. And for the time that they are performing, you let your soul and imagination and mind go there. In cinema, in film, in video, it's the other way around. It's what I call the unwilling suspension of disbelief. And the best example I can think of is from a movie called Night Moves, a 1980s film noir. And in the scene that I used to use in my class to prove that was Melanie Griffith, as a very young girl, is swimming nude at night in a bay. And in the distance, a plane starts to get closer and closer. It's a float plane, you realize. And then as it circles around, she's totally unaware of it. It gets lower and lower, and then you realize it's going to land. And then you realize the way that it is edited and shot, that it's going to land very close to her. And then you realize it's going to hit her, and it does. And the plane flips over, and it's a horrific scene with the water filled with blood and quite dramatic. All of my classes agreed that they were horrified, that they were shocked, that they were surprised, even though they knew that Melanie Griffith was still alive, that this is just a movie, that these were all actors, and this is just pretend. But for that instant, they had unwillingly suspended their disbelief. So that's the kind of magic that we're trying to create in screen stories, that you have to see a story that's going to become magical once it's filmed, once it's put together with all the best technical and human resources that are possible. And you have to believe, and this is very important, particularly at the beginning, that this is a collaborative art. If you read screenwriters from Hollywood, they will complain, they will argue that this is a terrible industry and that they have had terrible injustices done to them. Meanwhile, they're writing it from their kidney-shaped pool in Hollywood with lots of wealth in their pocket. Everybody who starts making a film wants to make the best film they can, and so they want to contribute their own way. And when film comes together, it's a magical, magical medium. So you have to believe that your story will get to the screen in the best possible way. But first of all, you have to write a great screen story.